It's so nice to see some faces, even if it's in the Zoom box, that I haven't seen in a long time. So hello to all of you. And I'm going to give a brief overview of what Finger Lakes ReUse is doing, and then kind of end with and segue into Felix's component, where we've had this amazing collaboration that's still ongoing. And as far as how I got into this and any kind of new ventures that you're trying to accuse me of, Peter, I think building materials are actually the reason I got into this whole racket. A little over a year ago, I finally graduated into having worked more years in nonprofit management than I did as a bartender. I was a bartender in this community for 19 years. Several of those years overlapped with my early years as the program manager at Significant Elements, where I managed the architectural salvage program. I was the first paid employee at that program. Delighted to say that along with Felix, we've been collaborating with Historic Ithaca and Significant Elements on and Crowd as well on the Collegetown project that we're going to talk about. But building materials are my passion. I've been believing in deconstruction ever since I learned what it was. When I think it was before Google existed. I think I was using Dogpile as a search engine and was looking up salvage and learned about these national deconstruction conferences and this very, very small group of people who were focused on this as an important thing. And I feel very fortunate that I've gotten into this and had the autonomy to help be part of the creation of an organization that's got a triple bottom line mission. And so let me just get into it. But I'm really, really honored to be here with this group. I would be attending TCCPI more, but I'm on the board of the Human Services Coalition that meets the fourth Friday of every month. So it's once in a blue moon, really, that I don't overlap. So glad to be here today. Let's see. Okay, so the first thing I want to start with is, we have these constructs around how materials management is, where reuse fits in it, and I would like to invite you to expand thinking around that. So, no worthy problem is ever solved in the plane of its original conception. So invite you to open your minds to what I want to offer, and this will just be a light overview, but hopefully the beginning of continued conversation. So we all know how materials are managed. This is a landfill in Indonesia. This was an image from Humphrey Fellows who we worked with, Sultanat, and this is horrific, but illegal dumps and how materials are managed is, you guys know it's pretty terrible, and the linkages to climate change are there and documented. But one of the things that the materials management industry kind of does is it even though reduce, reuse, recycle is in theory in order of priority, all the investment has gone into recycling because the perceived volume is greater than what's actually reusable in the landfill. But in reality, if you look at the value, it is a much greater value, and actually if there were more investment in targeting reusable and repairable materials, this is not to scale, but I'm trying to illustrate that there is tremendous economic leakage out of all of our communities in terms of jobs, skills, repair, education, community engagement, energy savings, local economies, embodied carbon, keeping plastics in use, greenhouse gas avoidance, and on and on and on. And there's an extraction side to that's avoided when materials are reused. And I know all this is obvious to all of you. So our mission, like I said, it's a triple bottom line mission to enhance community, economy, and environment through reuse. Our goals to make that mission seem a little less amorphous is to reduce waste, relieve poverty, and teach skills through reuse activities. And our vision that our board came up with just a few years ago at a retreat is for a just, resilient, and waste-free world that values both people and resources. We're not just about the stuff, we're definitely about human impact. This year, we think we're going to sell over 1 million items. That's 2,700 items going through our locations and out the door a day. We expect to hit around 2.4 million in sales. Of course, our payroll is about that as well. We're at 75 employees. And you hear a lot about supply chain disruption, but really we've experienced supply chain eruption. The volume of increased donations has been incredibly challenging, and we've been trying to grow to meet those challenges. So we've increased our staffing, we're trying to increase our volunteering, and our sales have increased as well, but not quite at the pace. So the last couple of years have been really very difficult. We've been in the woods. I mean, like everyone else, this has been a really extraordinarily challenging time. ReUse has a slightly different type of problems with this just overwhelming supply of materials coming at us. We're a growth industry. We've averaged more than 20% sales growth over the last 10 years. And you can see where we've expanded how that's, the blue line is our sales and revenues, and the gold line is contributed revenues, grants, donations, contracts with government. In 2020 and 2021, it jumped partly because of PPP, but partly because we asked for more help to try to help meet this, this enormous volume coming at us. And we're still not getting it all. And I'm happy to say that in March, our sales were almost 30% over last year. So we've made a lot of changes, and we're just continuing to grow. And we're just overwhelmed with every kind of material. And this is kind of the sensation that I've continued to have during this, and many of my coworkers. It's a big, big issue. There are things that we're not getting to. We're actually not actively doing deconstruction right now. We've done a couple of pilot one-offs, and we're going to talk about that, Felix especially. But there's, batteries come in, everything that's donated to us. Appliances, if we could have a repair program, mattresses are a huge issue. There's a huge need for them. But there's a shift in the public perception as well. And really, the Ithaca Journal let us know that we won not best thrift store, but best department store last year. And I just really enjoy the finalists that we beat out. But hopefully there's this shift in public perception around what ReUse can be, and we'll continue to grow into that department store-like environment, and hopefully have a lot more of it. We're always trying to link ReUse to environmental issues and human rights issues, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. People want to kind of pigeonhole us into the number 12 goal, but actually there's not a goal on here that you can't relate ReUse to in some sort of way. So we got a grant from the New York State DEC to do some murals to kind of highlight and educate the public around how ReUse does have those linkages. So inside the Ithaca ReUse Center, all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals are around the top, and just some really beautiful stuff. If you haven't been in lately, come in and just look at the beautiful art, and then there's all the materials as well. So just a quick thing, because I know most of you are probably pretty familiar. We are trying to make reusing really, really convenient for people. So we take a very wide range of materials just to try to make it a one-stop drop. And we've got 2 locations. And I'm just going to quickly click through, just some of the amazing people that I work with, and just, the sense of agency and connection that people have when they work with us is, it's a phenomenon. It's really a wonderful thing to look at. So we refurbish computers. We're a licensed Microsoft refurbisher. Electronics are also a huge, huge issue. They're getting smaller, but there's more of it. So that's really challenging. We have a job training program to help us manage all of this material. And this sense of engagement that happens, I think really helps us have a strong and growing place in the workforce development and education field. So these components of mastery, mindfulness, and mattering, those all are happening organically in our locations. And I link a TED Talk here, and I'm happy to send people if they want to watch it. But he's quite articulate around why this is important. And I saw the links to ReUse and what's happening. It comes less from how we're training people, and it's more about the nature of this work. And there's all sorts of different skills that can be learned. here at ReUse. So we're partnering, and we have growing partnerships with other entities to continue to explore the potential there. We're just really starting on that. We give a lot of materials away. Last year we gave materials to over 300 households. Our price, that's $75,000. Our prices are well below half of what you can get stuff for new. So that's some significant support for the community. We also helped a bunch of nonprofits. We offer 1 free delivery per household. That's another program that's continuing to grow. We do it in partnership with other nonprofit organizations. They refer people to us, so clients don't have to do any paperwork when they come here. We also, we have a little bit of repair, volunteer repair. So, and these photos are from an event we started right before COVID hit. We had 2 Kids Fix events. And I think, you know, this is the future. Watching this intergenerational exchange of skills is just so exciting. To me, this is what gives me hope. And these were incredibly popular. And we're looking to restart the Ithaca Fixers Collective up at our expanded space, up at the Trip Hammer ReUse Mega Center. Got some really nice space up there that we're working toward getting ready to open back up to the public. So, like I said, deconstruction has really been on the back burner for us. We've been so overwhelmed with incoming materials, it's hard for us to really be hungry to go out and get more materials. This is the house that we deconstructed that Felix will talk about up in Collegetown, but there were 10 other houses up there. Oh, these are a couple of shots of our deconstruction program. We deconstructed many houses from 2009 to, I think we've really stopped in about 2016 or 17. We did our last whole house. We did one with Cortland ReUse. They were getting up and running and we were helping them. So we, in the summer of 2020, helped them deconstruct this house in the background. It was our tools and our insurance and their volunteers. And we contracted with the, I guess with Cortland County to take this house down. So here's the houses in Collegetown. There were 11 of them, there were 12 of them. One got demolished early on and we salvaged out of 10 of them. And then we fully deconstructed one of them, but they were large houses. The one in the middle is the one we deconstructed, which I believe was over 4,000 square feet. We were able to engage through our partnership with Crowd and Historic Ithaca Significant Elements, more than 60 volunteers to help us pull up flooring, baseboard, radiators, kitchens. We saved as much as we could. We got a small percentage of what really was valuable. Beautiful floors. We got lots and lots of oak flooring. There was one house that was filled with fir flooring. Historic Ithaca took a lot of the significant elements. This was on a walkthrough I did with them, but they got the, they took the doors and we just said, please, there's so much, you know, take what you want. So they wanted the doors and the hardware and, you know, the architectural elements. And then we tried to come in and get the rest. And so the flooring, it was so much, I was able to make a connection with a local laborer, 785. Their training program worked pro bono for 2 weeks and pulled up flooring for us. And then we organized, this is them on their first morning. And then we were able to organize these bucket brigades with just these citizens for 5 weeks in the coldest, most bitter days over the holidays. Helped us. A retired plumber, Dave Warden, came and cut out a bunch of copper for us. I mean, it was just a really great, like kind of showing from the citizenry. Actually, this is our acting mayor, Laura Lewis. She showed up to work and she's actually come back and helped denail. We were able to, you know, just get as much as we could in this just amazing effort. So in the foreground is the flooring that we saved and we put it on we forklifted it onto our flatbed truck and then brought it downtown and we're denailing, you know, many, many piles like that. And in the background, you can see the demolition equipment is back there, you know, making these big piles of organic materials that are going to the landfill. This is the space we were able to kind of last minute rent so that we could absorb some of this material from Collegetown. It's the former DOT next to the farmer's market. So we're there right now denailing this stuff. This is inside the warehouse where we're doing the denailing. People ask, is there a market for all this stuff? We put this kitchen on the floor from one of the houses and it sold the next day. This is the denailing operation that's happening. The farmers market's in the background there. This is looking kind of north east up the lake. And here's that fir flooring in the foreground. And, one of the things I want to advocate for is that this is like my coworker, Scarlett, she's the manager here at Ithaca ReUse Center. It's not rocket surgery. Reuse is something that we know how to do. We don't need to wait for regulation. There's actually lots and lots of supply and demand. And I think that there should be a focus on some investment. We have shared goals with the people who are focused on the climate. There's great economic impacts from it. I think more reuse centers, a network of them, could help kind of make order out of the chaos, pull the batteries out, separate the stuff more proactively, generate revenue in the process. And save the date, coming up on June 16th is going to be the first statewide New York State Reuse Summit, where we're going to talk a little bit more about what that system could look like. And we're expecting some good interest and participation in that. We've worked with many partners. This is just some of them. And none of this would have happened without some really incredible support from partners who have invested in us from the beginning and have really helped us grow to get to where we are. And it still feels like this is early days. There's much more to do. Really excited about it. And thanks for the opportunity. I will say we are still looking for support from our community, and to this group in particular. We're looking for someone who has journalism skills, documentary skills, research, business planning. So anyone who knows someone or is interested, please, I invite you to reach out to me if you're interested or want to connect me with anyone. So thanks for your attention. I'll turn it over to Felix.
Thank you. Yeah, also from my side, it's a real pleasure to be here. See some familiar faces and some new faces, and it's it's great. It's great to connect and talk about these super important issues that Diane already laid out. And what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit more about why this is maybe super relevant for the built environment specifically, and how this one collaboration that we've had, one out of many, fortunately, fits into this bigger picture. As Peter already mentioned, I'm directing what is called the Circular Construction Lab at Cornell, which is a kind of interdisciplinary research unit that brings in students, but we're fortunate enough that we now managed to get some third-party funding to grow this lab. We're now 15 people, and we have the first kind of full researchers as well, which is changing the way we operate, since we're not having a student 8 hours per week doing something next to credits that is necessary as well, but really have full researchers that spend their week doing these things. So that's super exciting, and I'm really looking forward to how this keeps growing. I wanted to just a couple of slides zoom out very far because I think it's super important to see where we are right now and how this fits into the last 800,000 years. So for the last 800,000 years, the climate on this planet has been influenced by what is called the Milankovitch cycles. And so these are 3 sinus curves that are overlapping, which have to do with the eccentricity, obliquity, and precession of the Earth's rotation and orbit towards the sun. And if you overlay these 3 curves that you see at the bottom, then you get this line, the green line at the top of the slide. And every time there's a peak here, you have an ice age in our climate over the last 800,000 years. So the scale is planetary that influenced Earth's climate. And now these curves here are showing a much smaller time scale, and you can see a varied array of different curves. Doesn't matter if we look at temperature or fertilizer consumption or GDP or population growth, et cetera, right? All these graphs charts are eerily similar. They all pick up in the 1950s, and then at least for the beginning have an exponential growth connected to it. And that is the reason why we now talk about the Anthropocene, or maybe the Capitalocene. That name hasn't really been decided yet, but it is clear that human influence overtook planetary scales. And I think this is something that we should put into our minds when we talk about the scale of what we're in right now, in terms of climate crisis and many other crises that the planet is facing. And so if we talk about this under the lens of construction, then the chart about resource extraction from the Earth's crust looks exactly the same. It's an exponential growth that starts in the 1950s, and magenta here is everything that has to do with building materials. And on the right side, you see the per capita consumption, so that you can't say, well, we're just more people on the planet, so we all need more materials in total, right? We all of us reuse more material in a very similar scale. And that leads to the fact that the built environment, if you look at buildings over their whole life cycle, right now account for more than 50% of resource consumption, more than 50% of waste production, and probably more than 40% of carbon emissions globally. And that carbon curve is, again, the same thing. 1950s goes straight up, right? So all these curves are showing a similar image. And what we need to do is basically mirror this chart, right? So this is what we would need to do to stay within the 1.5 degree climate target that was agreed in Paris, and you see that's very small in the bottom, which means that in the built environment, we would need to reduce carbon emissions by 65% by 2030, which is enormous, considering the scale of that intervention, the scale of the industry, the amount of actors that are involved in it, and the slow speed that the built environment is moving at, right? I mean, building a building essentially takes on that timeline between now and 2030. So it's not like we have quick overturn where we can try out things and go through several cycles, but we need to move very, very quickly to make this work. And so the reason why we talk about carbon, there are two sides to that. There's, of course, the kind of building operation, right, which is 28% of that pie chart. And that's just heating, cooling, everything we do in buildings that emits carbon. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, and all of you know most of this, but I think it's important to set up the argument, because 11% come from the production of materials and the construction. But if you look at this over time, then these numbers suddenly look very different, because that 28 to 11% is the ratio that you get when you look at this over the full life cycle of a building. Now, we want to make quick changes, as I just showed, right? And so if we want to make changes in the next 8 years till 2030, then the upfront emissions that come from the production of these materials and the construction suddenly are 74% of that pie chart, and not 50 or even 11 anymore, right? Because carbon emissions from the operation come little by little every year, versus all the embodied carbon is emitted on day one of a building's existence. And so quick change only comes if we really talk about materials. And then the carbon, the greenest material is one that's already there, right? So reclaimed material, you see that at the bottom, it has the least carbon impact, because you don't need to produce that material anymore. You only have to possibly remanufacture it or reprocess it and maybe transport it, ideally very locally. And so these emissions are considerably smaller than any other material that we have available. And so this is, as I mentioned, what we're trying to do at the Circular Construction Lab. We're working towards the implementation of a circular economy in the built environment, which we define, similar to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, as a system that is restorative and regenerative by design, that keeps products, components, and materials at their highest utility and value at all times, and distinguishes between technical and biological cycles. And I mean, from an architectural perspective, I'd always tell my students the most important word in this definition is by design, right? It's a call to action for us to change the system, to not change the filter at the end of a process to take out a couple of emissions, but go to the beginning of that cycle and change the way we operate. That's the team, just so that you have some faces to it. But what I really want to talk about is this initiative that we started actually in 2021 when we were awarded a Engaged Cornell grant, which had the title Circle, and really thinks about kind of researching construction in the local economy. We wanted to find out what is Ithaca specific in this conversation, right? The circular economy is something that has been talked about for the last 30 years, or maybe even longer, maybe 50, 60, if you go back to kind of the first times these terms appeared, but they haven't really been able to implement. And the reason is that it is a very, very local task to implement this, right? It really depends on what is the local infrastructure, what kind of capacity does the local community have to implement these things. And so we wanted to see how can this global aspiration be applied to Ithaca specifically. And that's what this grant is about, with fantastic partners like Felix ReUse, but also Trade Design Build, Tatum Engineering, the Cornell Corporate Extension of Tompkins County, and Ithaca NHS. And one of the things we started looking at is demolition and deconstruction. And demolition, you see here a picture from Green Street that is actually considered quite up to date, right? This project here, this is the taking down of that parking garage. But then we talked to the foreman on the construction side, and yes, all the concrete was recycled, but as downcycling, it went to it was ground down and now it's used for under road construction. And the steel was collected and shipped to China, which you could also kind of question from a term of that definition of a circular economy, the highest utility and value of all times, right? So even though, and I think this really fits to what Diane mentioned, the recycling pyramid is one that treats a high amount of materials, but at a very low value. And so how do we do this differently was what we then thought about when this opportunity arose, the Catherine Commons project, that to make space for 300 new housing units, asked for a demolition permit for 11 houses on College Avenue. And so this is an aerial picture of that demolition where the excavator just goes through 10 buildings and now eats them up. And you see the enormity of that pile of materials that is just lost. The excavator drives over it, it breaks these things. The value is being lost because of the process that is being applied. And what we managed to do is convince the developer that out of this 11 houses, we're able to deconstruct one as a comparison to the other 10 that are being demolished. And so this is the picture of that. In the foreground, you see the deconstruction. In the background, you see the demolition. And the interesting thing here is, and this is of course me as an academic speaking now, that you had this 11 houses that are built in the same time that were roughly the same size. And so you start to be able to compare these processes also scientifically. And this is something that now hopefully all the reports that come out of this project will show, where we can compare how much waste was produced in one and how much waste was produced in the other, but also what is the economic benefit, what's the community benefit, what are the materials that are being saved in these processes. And so that comparison will become very important, I think, for the conversation that we're having here locally, because it is numbers that are based on local labor wages, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just going to fly through some of these pictures. Many of you may have seen the video and the documentation. What is different here, maybe to several other deconstruction processes that we've seen so far, is that we had only a window of 1 week to do this, because the developer said, yes, you can do it, but only as long as it doesn't impact my timeline. and my budget in this case as well. And so we had 1 week to get this house down, which meant that a traditional unbuilding process wasn't feasible. You would need at least 3-4 weeks to take out every beam separately from that site. And so we switched to a panelized deconstruction process, which basically cuts the biggest possible pieces out of the house and then moves those pieces on a flatbed truck, brings them off-site, where they're now being denailed and processed still continuously. But at the same time, the developer is already putting in foundations right now for the new building, right? And so these processes can now be done in parallel, which I think is one step towards a more industrialized process of thinking about deconstruction. Many of the things that Diane mentioned can be seen in these pictures as well. This is, for example, the local labor union that is helping us prepare these houses for the deconstruction, taking out the windows, salvaging whatever is possible. And I think it's really amazing that this is part of their kind of apprenticeship program. The local union was really interested in bringing their apprentices on the site and talk about deconstruction as part of their workforce development program. And then you see these images where these big panels are just lifted off the house as a gable wall or as a facade or as a floor plate. Part of this is, of course, the salvaging process. So radiators, on the right side, you see the chimney after it's been deconstructed. And all of these materials then essentially were brought down to what is now ReDot, the Finger Lakes, new Finger Lakes location in the former DOT site. And here you see the house in its new configuration as a material resource for a next use. And this is a picture of all the things that Diane also showed. And this is a process of what is going on right now. There's fantastic volunteer activity 3-4 times per week. Volunteers are down there processing these materials, denailing them, sorting them, etc. Part of the process, of course, is also, and this is really where now the documentation comes in, to know what is in there, what kind of contaminants do we, for example, in these houses. Of course, these houses were using lead paint, and so when we did first tests on the paint, it lit up bright red. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with asbestos in these buildings? Because the last thing you want to do is circulate contaminants, right? So there's some things that you need to take out of the circle, and then others that you can, at high value and utility, start circulating. And so how do we do this as part of that conversation? But also part of the conversation is, what are the materials that are in these buildings? And so these are images from our salvage and deconstruction survey toolkit that we're developing. That is essentially a tool that allows us, before we even start demolishing or deconstructing, to estimate the material content of a building. So this is combining LiDAR scanning and a kind of Excel spreadsheet. And by linking these two with algorithms, we can, within hours, estimate the material content of a building now. And then that allows us, to also evaluate different processes. What kind of strategy would be most applicable to that specific house in salvaging the most amount of materials, or getting out the highest value of materials, et cetera, et cetera. So this is also a decision-making tool for us. And then, just as an information, some of the materials that we salvaged from that house are now being used to install a small installation as part of the Cornell Council of the Arts Biennial, which will open in September. And so this is a little staircase, call it Circulating Matters, that is made out of that house in Collegetown, but made in terms of the kind of maximization of reuse. So this is designed for disassembly, so that the materials that we use here ideally can then go somewhere else after the end of the installation as well. I don't know how I'm on time, but I think what is important to look at is how this fits into the bigger context, how this one example is informing the bigger conversation, especially in Ithaca. And so Diane and myself were also both founding partners of Crowd, which I'm sure many of you have heard already, as a kind of partner network. And Crowd is really working on policy changes and advising municipalities in the Finger Lakes region, and now going towards kind of central New York, on how to maximize salvage and deconstruction in local communities. The first thing that came out is this Crowd resource guide, which can be downloaded at the Susan Christopherson Center's website. And what is being done right now is the work of a kind of model deconstruction ordinance, which we're in close conversation with the city to figure out, how can we implement some of this in policy in this local setting. And to inform this, I'm right now with 5 students from the business school, really thinking through every step that we did in this deconstruction project in terms of a business case. So how could we use all the numbers that we generated to calculate a business model, and then figure out where are the economies of scale in that business model. So what if we don't only have one case study, but if we do 10, how does it look like? Is this a feasible case study in the local setting? How many would we need to sustain a business model like that, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a really interesting conversation going on right now. And it also fits into the current Ithaca Green New Deal conversation that I know you're all aware of, because Louis, I think, presented a couple of weeks ago to the same panel. And our interest in that is to inform, basically by modeling a digital twin of the city, to inform some of the decisions in terms of what is an operational carbon neutrality and what is maybe an embodied carbon neutrality, and how does carbon neutrality and decarbonization look at when we look at it holistically from both of these emitters that I showed in the very beginning of the presentation. And so the reason why I'm showing it is because that, of course, the information that we're gathering now by going into buildings, by deconstructing buildings, and the knowledge of how these buildings were built starts informing this model through the development of archetypes, for example. And so this is a first estimate of the material content of Ithaca, what you see here. But this will be refined in the next couple of months when this model is getting better and better. And so then we can use this decision-making framework tool that you see here, which is still, unfortunately, still a prototype, but also that will be rolled out over the summer. And you can then really look at, building by building, district by district, what is the relationship between embodied carbon and operational carbon, and what would scenario changes result in terms of materials going in and out of the built environment. And if you want to know any more, you can always find more in these books. The right one is really exciting. It's only coming out in fall, but it has basically 5 chapters on Ithaca in it. Diane wrote a chapter in it. And it involves many of the things that we're working on right now. And so I think this could be an interesting resource moving forward. And I'm really looking forward to your questions about this.
Thanks, Diane and Felix. That was really fabulous. Just so exciting to see this really neglected area addressed so, shall I say, concretely. I'm just amazed at the thinking behind this and the collection of data and analysis that can be put to really practical use. I think that's where we really do move beyond just theory to application in some really significant ways. I'm going to see what kinds of questions that folks might have. And your minds may just be so blown that it might take you a few minutes or so to collect yourself. But I know that we've all been doing a lot of thinking about how do we decarbonize buildings in the city and in the county as a whole. And this is whole nother approach. I think especially the distinction you made, Felix, between operational carbon neutrality and embodied carbon neutrality, I think is really important. I can feel myself pushing back against that, saying, oh God, something else we have to take into account. But on the other hand, we do. And so Kareem, you have a question.
Thank you. Both presentations were fantastic and really rich. My understanding is that most of the buildings in New York State that will be around in 2050 already are around. Like most of the buildings have already been built. So I'm just wondering of a sense of the relative importance of, say, deconstruction compared to, like the stuff that Diane was talking about in general about repair and reducing some of the other stuff that's just going to the dump versus sort of policies that are needed to stop making crap, like stuff that's built for the dump. Yeah, just like all of these things are obviously important, but do you have a sense of the relative importance of these different pieces? Just that's helpful for me when I think about this stuff.
That question's for you, Felix, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, I can take it. So yes, I think the first statement that you make is completely true. We're in a very productive economy, we're turning over about 2% of the built environment per year, which naturally leads to the understanding that most of what is going to be there in 2050 is already around now, which is good because the best thing we can do with a building is to maybe adaptively reuse it, and the last resort is taking it down and deconstructing it. Taking out demolition completely from that picture, right? So I think that is a really important statement. Now, what we do need to do is retrofit much of what is already around. And so also in these scenarios, I think the question how we use material in a retrofitting scenario is super important, and reusing material in a retrofitting scenario, it's even easier in a retrofitting scenario than if you have to bring in, like big structural beams for a new building. There you might have a different policy conversation and code conversation than if it's in a retrofitting scenario. So I think that that part of the conversation, I fully agree with you. Then the next point we can talk about is the sheer numbers. The US is producing about 600 million tons of demolition and deconstruction waste per year, which is twice the amount that we produce from municipal solid waste. And so each of us, even though we're spending time recycling, bringing our recycling to the curb, right? You can double that, and it's what is being produced in your name as construction and demolition waste every week. And we're just not aware of it because we're not dealing with it personally, right? But it is produced. If you count it per capita, it's produced in your name by someone else. And so I think there is an immense amount of materials that goes to landfill and that's being wasted. And that needs to be addressed. And I think it can be addressed through at least taking on part of where this waste comes from. And much of it comes from demolition. 90% of that 600 million tons comes from demolition. So if we change the way we deal with the end of a life of a building, we can do a lot of good, right? And what we can do in the process is save these not only material values, but also historic values, the kind of knowledge and skill that is embedded in these materials as a local value, and bring them back into retrofitting scenarios. So close that loop there. And so we don't need to reproduce new materials to retrofit and decarbonize and make our buildings future-proof. And so connecting these two pieces of the conversation for me is an essential component as well.
Great. David Kay, you have a question.
Hi, thanks, Felix and Diane. Very exciting work, and it's just kind of thrilling to see how much has evolved, you know, in my increasingly long lifetime around this issue, and how much progress has been made. So my question is really about, I'm always very interested in sort of scalability questions and, you know, how far we can go with this in theory. So, you know, at the local level, Diane, I'm particularly interested in if you could talk a little more about, you know, sort of where the constraints in the system really are right now. I mean, you talked a lot about the recent growth, and, you know, just give us a better sense of, like, you know, what you would need to be able to, like, double, triple, quadruple, you know, and what the limits there really are locally. And then I wonder if one of you could also talk about that kind of sense of possible growth trajectories and where the limits are for the industry as a whole.
Sure. I mean, it's the big question. I'm taking next week off from normal meetings so that I can work on this in anticipation of the summit, and trying to at least pencil out what does a system look like. I've been in this industry for 20 years. I've been looking at it, I've been kind of studying it, trying to understand it. The short answer is it's very overwhelming, but what we're demonstrating is, you know, one of the first two questions is actually when we were thinking about expanding to a second location and purchasing a building, you know, 6 miles from our first place, you know, our board, everyone was nervous. And I was saying, I'm pretty sure there's enough stuff. Like, that was a question, right? And we have demonstrated that with more visibility, it's not even close to enough just to serve Tompkins County. So trying to understand, you know, we called ourselves Finger Lakes ReUse. And I remember thinking about 3 or 4 years in, I'm like, we're not even close to the bottom of the pile here. We need to keep drilling down. And I think that, you know, reuse, especially from a climate standpoint, but no matter how you slice it, the more local it is, the more impactful it is. And, you know, keeping the building standing, repairing things as they are, all this stuff is here in the community. None of it should go into the landfill if it's good, serviceable material, and it could become feedstocks for other enterprises. So that's what I'm trying to look at. I do not think that it's a nonprofit network. I think that there's a lot of for-profit. I think there should be contracting as materials management, just like Casella contracts to handle the recycling. I think that there should be a reuse type of enterprise that's contracting to manage reusable materials. And what I'm working on is kind of trying to illustrate a series of hubs. We need Tompkins County still needs a large scale place to do the large scale building materials. We're demonstrating, and I would invite any of you to come for a tour, and we're trying to have a number of social events. We'll try to get an invitation to you, Peter, to share out with everyone at TCCPI to come by what we're calling ReDOT. It's the New York State DOT, and we put a re on front of everything just to amuse ourselves. But it's where we're processing this material. But some of the floorboards they're like 18 feet long, and we stack them vertically so we can see what the length is, and then we bundle like lengths together. And having these high ceilings and high bays and being able to work with forklifts, we need large space for building materials. We need large space for appliance repair, mattress refurbishment. Like there's, and that space exists, less in Tompkins County, but really in most areas. And then the retail outlets, the exchanges of materials where people can drop stuff off conveniently and purchase things. You know, that's just normal retail infrastructure. That's everywhere. So the infrastructure is there. And it also can take a really important role, I think, in the labor force development and engagement, that engagement piece that everybody's like, where are the workers? I think ReUse is demonstrating we can meet people where they are, we can engage them, we can help them build skills, we can help them build consistency in their work practices. And then we've had a lot of people move through ReUse to other careers. And I think that's a really, really key role in this materials management aspect. I hope that answered your question. I think I think that the greatest barrier to doing this is getting onto people's priority list, because reuse gets, I don't have a chip on my shoulder, but reduce, reuse, recycle, we're the overlooked middle name. This ReUse Summit is sponsored by NYSAR 3, New York State Association of Reduce, Reuse, Recycle. I've been going to it for 18, 19 years. Every 3 years, I've been presenting, saying, "Hi, Diane, with the reuse, the overlooked middle child of NYSAR." And just in last year, in 2021, they finally formed a reuse committee to focus on reuse. After all these years, they've had a food waste, they've had textiles, they've focused on all these things, but now they're kind of, as everybody's recycling budgets are hemorrhaging, they're like, maybe we should talk to her more. And so that's been really, really super exciting. So we're excited to have this summit. I think we're gonna get onto the radar, and hopefully get some investment from, I think, New York State and local communities to have the will and put it on their priority list of really low-hanging fruit. So we're trying to figure out how to scale up and provide that technical assistance to other communities, because there's a ton of interest right now.
So, Diane, even though you are the overlooked middle child, you did just receive a Lifetime Achievement Award from this particular organization. So great recognition, long deserved, and there it is.
Mm-hmm.
So congratulations on
Thank you.
that. Brian, you have a question.
It's out of recycled material, not reused, but it's okay.
Yeah, so everybody on this call is aware of the Climate Action Council's working on preparing a climate action plan for New York State. And they've done, they had the advisory committees, and they have the draft scoping document that's under public review now. They have 5,000 comments as of a couple of weeks ago. I anticipate there'll be like 25,000, 30 more. It's a very exciting process. I know Diane's working on some comments. I don't know if Felix, if you are, but you both have really unique contributions. I mean, many of the comments are going to be repetitive. That's good, because that shows what people are interested in, but we need to get unique comments also. And I urge you both to do that. And I just came from the New York Geo Conference, 3 days in Albany. We were talking a lot about this. Luis was a keynote speaker. He really lifted the roof off the building. Bob Howarth was a speaker on the panel. Irene Weiser was a speaker. So there's a lot of excitement. We got a chance to meet with industry folks and government folks, and it was a very exciting opportunity. So Felix, I'd like to find out if you're considering submitting comments on the building sector at least.
Yes, we are. We also just now wrote like a little summary that comes out from the crowd group with recommendations on what you should submit if you wanted to submit, and explanation how to submit your comments, and we'll circulate that widely, trying to get students on board to submit things. Anyone who lives in New York, essentially, we're trying to convince to submit to that, to add to the 25,000 comments. But yeah, you're very right. It's super important to, and I think Diane, you did a read through, and really the built environment, and especially embodied carbon, is not mentioned in the current proposal, and so there are big missing pieces to the conversation about carbon emissions and carbon neutrality in New York, and so that is even more important to bring that side of the conversation to this to the scoping process.
So anything, Felix and Diane, that you want to share with the TCCPI group in terms of guidance for those comments, just send that to me, and I'll get it out to the group.
Will do. Thank you.
Absolutely. Dawn, you have a question.
Yeah, thanks. Felix and Diane, that was great. I have not been as aware of what is going on in terms of deconstruction. And every time I thought, oh, well, now this step probably needs to happen, that you guys talked about having done that step. So such amazing comprehensive work. what I'm thinking about is the kind of the it's not a tail end if it's circular, but I was going to say the tail end, which is the market for purchasing and the buyers and how do we, and I don't know if you experience it this way, but I always think of this work as sort of being a niche market as far as those who are purchasing. And I think what we are talking about is clearly this needs to be a mainstream market. This is how we need to be going towards any type of building in the future. In terms of being in cooperative extension, thinking about, we do education, and part of the education around addressing climate change is going to be really talking about changing behavior. So I just wonder if you are thinking along those lines, what are you thinking about, and where do you see those in those markets, and where do you see those buyers, and how do you see us sort of shifting the way that we, the mainstream of construction these days?
Well, I think there's steps, but I think Finger Lakes ReUse is demonstrating the mainstreaming of purchasing used materials in general. I mean, we have a hard time keeping building materials in stock. The demand is, I think people wonder about the demand or think that it's a specialty, but in reality, there have been long, ongoing, successful ventures that are focused on building materials for 20 years all around the country. There's a great private one called Second Use in Seattle that's just doing it really well. They're focused on it. We started with building materials, household goods, and furniture just to try to balance the things that we saw had no real outlet for. And then we've expanded over time for a number of reasons. But building materials alone is not a niche market. And I think that in order to get contractors buying in, you have to have a certain amount of volume. And so that's the type of thing that you can't have volume until you have the right size facility. If we had the right size facility and a built-in workforce, we could have gotten triple, quadruple, 10 times the amount of material we actually got out of those houses that came down. And we were able to demonstrate that it can be done in 5 days, while the guy who was on the operator of the demolition equipment had COVID. We actually were moving forward with our crew. And so I think that timing barrier, we've been able to take that one down. The space, that capacity is really, really key. But the market will come, like just the price of materials makes it mainstream. All Americans are conditioned to shop for a deal. And so if they see this high quality stuff and it's half the price that you can get it at Lowe's or Home Depot, they're gonna stop at ReUse first. And that's what's happening all the time. That's what we're demonstrating down at the Ithaca ReUse Center right now.
Maybe if I can add a couple of thoughts here, because matching demand and supply in the generation of buildings is actually one of the key problems in scaling reuse. And it's interesting that basically even though Diane is selling everything in one day, right? Most of this still goes to do it yourself renovations, and not big contractors coming in and say, hey, I'm building 20 townhouses. I'm going to shop at Finger Lakes ReUse. And if we take the scaling process seriously, then that's also who we want to reach at some point. But for that to be possible, we need to change the whole system thinking of how an architect starts designing a project, because right now we start with a form, right? We say, oh, this is going to look great. And then you at some point talk to the engineer, and the engineer says, well, but you need some foundations here and there. And then you get a list of materials, and then you go to Lowe's and say, I need this specific list of materials that came out of the requirements from the conversation that started with a form. Now, if you turn that process upside down and say, hey, I have these types of materials available, what can I make out of it? Then that whole conversation changes, right? And then you can bring in that material question a year earlier, which is where we need to be. Because if you bring that conversation about material in at the kind of permitting stage, it's too late, because many of the big decisions about how to be carbon neutral in a building design have been done already. And you can only, like shift a little bit here and make it a bit greener, but you cannot change the whole paradigm anymore. And you need to do that at the very, very beginning. Also, because at the very beginning, that different decision and that different proposal doesn't cost you much, right? You can still shift and pivot as long as it's just a sketch. But once you have 20 planners involved, making fundamental changes suddenly gets very expensive. And so you need to start from that material conversation way earlier than we're doing right now. And that's something that we bring into the conversation at Cornell now. I had the fortune to be teaching the first year studios for the last 2 years. And so really at the beginning, the really young minds, I try to kind of shape that, bring that into their design process to start from the material and then develop form from that. And we'll see where that goes. I think they're super excited about this change in how we address the design process. But what we also need, and that's where these tools come in that we're trying to develop, is we need to know way before we take materials out of a building what these materials are and what qualities they have, so that ideally we can pre-sell them before we even start deconstructing. Right? And so that way, you take out the half year of post-processing at a facility that is costly, that needs space, etc., and go from the deconstruction side to the construction side, ideally directly. There's some exciting things happening. For example, with Dave Benning as a kind of deconstruction expert from the Seattle area, who we were able to bring in to help us on this project. And he really sells prefabricated house kits, cuts them out of buildings and brings you those panels so that you can build your new house. But he sells them before he even starts cutting those panels, because then you can still order. You can say, well, I needed 8 foot or I needed 7 foot, and he cuts it for you out of the house, custom made, and you get what you want and you pay before, and he can kind of sustain his business because he has upfront money. There's a whole different economic environment that can be part of this conversation if we change the timelines of these different processes.
That's just so fabulous, Felix. The whole notion of starting with materials first and then figuring out what forms you can build from them. It struck me listening to you that's the source of a lot of vernacular architecture is beginning with the materials you have at hand. And I was thinking about the times that I visited the village where my grandfather grew up as a goat herder in the Alps. And, they didn't sit around and design a house and then say, what materials do we need? They grabbed the stones that were all around them and they built their homes out of those stones. And those houses have stood for hundreds of years. People can't even remember when the house was built. They've been there for so long. And I just think that's a really wise way to operate in the world. So that's a great way of framing it.
It's also the reason why Singapore and Dubai and New York look identical now, right? Because we start from the form, and then at some point, the only material that can do this form is reinforced concrete. And so that leads to a material monopoly, which leads to really questionable supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. So there are big systems engineering questions that are starting from that one little point that we as architects and engineers think, oh, this is a great form.
Yeah.
And so there is a lot to gain from a little bit of a rethinking of that process.
In a sense, the new vernacular architecture comes out of reusing those materials that we've already built, buildings that were not driven by materials, but by form. So now we have to take that process, as you said, and completely rethink it. It'll be really interesting to see how that evolves over the next few decades. Al George, you have a question.
Yeah, first of all, both of these talks were fantastic, and both of them gave me the the feeling that we're at the beginning of something big. I really, both of you are really in pioneering, in some sense, the scale of this kind of thing. It's just fantastic. The question I have is a systems related one, and that is, I think there's another dimension to this that I don't know how it fits in exactly, but it seems to me that we certainly have, this is important for sustainability, no doubt about that. Okay. Secondly, training labor. It seems like this is a really practical and sensible and sort of low cost way of training people to work in the economy, which we have a problem with people getting training as part of the Green New Deal in Ithaca, for example, is to try to get better employment for people, et cetera. And this is fantastic. The thing I'm interested in at the moment is just something else, is that I'm a customer of ReUse, and I'm not building anything, so I can't say I'm going to recycle anything Felix has come up with. But it seems to me it's a standard of living thing, that basically both of these things are going to lower costs and make life more, a higher standard of living for any particular group of people who do this. Instead of going down to one of the big box stores and buying a new appliance or something like that, or a pot or something like that, if you go and get them in ReUse, it seems to me, and it's true for me certainly, that you save money and keeps things from the landfill, and the sustainability. Those are all almost secondary for the customer of an individual thing. So has anybody looked into how this affects standard of living on a sort of average sense, or even by demographics?
That's something I would love to be able to study, but have not been able to figure out how to. I know that we have an optional, you can sign up to be a super reuser. It's not really a membership, but basically you give us your email in exchange for us giving you 10%. We used to give 10% to students and to landlords and to contractors. And I was like, well, let's give it to everybody, right? And so we have around 10,000 people signed up for that. They account for about 40% of our sales. We also have another running discount. So you could argue that everybody who shops at ReUse has a economic, I mean, you could kind of double our sales. So if we're going to do $2.4 million this year, that's probably $2.4 million of economic relief that we're providing to X number of households, however many individuals shop. But I'm not sure how else to break that down further.
I'm interested in that, and I don't know if I have the bandwidth to do it, but I wouldn't mind getting a project going with students on trying to do that. But I no promises at all.
Would love to talk.
I'll try to do that. Yes, thank you.
So we have a couple of questions in chat. Let's see. And I guess, yeah, Felix, you've addressed one of them about the certification of used materials. And you're saying that reused timber can only be used in structural applications after regrading and recertification in New York. There was also another question from Kareem about examples of municipal policy that require reused construction materials, and that it seemed like a good direction to go in. So has anybody gone that far down the road to actually create policies that drive this kind of reuse?
No, at least not that I'm aware of. What is being required in several new policies is a percentage of reclaimed, or what's the word I'm looking for? Basically saved from landfill. You would need, for example, to save at least 70% of the materials when you take down a building into secondary users. Most of that is still low grade recycling, but at least it diverts these materials from landfill. So on that side of the spectrum, we do have legislation that comes into play. There's no mandatory requirements yet to build a building out of reused materials, at least not in the US that I'm aware of. The town of Ithaca is is introducing something really interesting right now, trying to figure out how to deal with the new energy code supplement and the sub point of getting points for reused materials, and how do you quantify that? As far as I know, the last proposal for this that I think was voted actually into action is that if you want these points, you need to retain at least 50% of the surface area of the walls and ceilings of a building. And there we're getting into this conversation, right? Where you suddenly, you can't tear down a house anymore. You have to adaptively reuse it to get these bonus points. And I think that's an interesting first step of trying to quantify reuse in the built environment. I'm not sure if it's the non plus ultra yet, but I think this is a really expert starting point for that conversation.
Great. So we've got to move on, but I have to say, this is a word that Diane used at the outset, honor. It's just been a tremendous honor to have the two of you here today talking with us. It's just, I feel like we were just present at the dawn of creation almost. You gave us a vision of this new era, and it's so hopeful, and gosh knows we need hope these days. And so thanks very much for bringing that energy to the table and really opening up a new vista for us this morning. And please, we'd love to have you come back a few months down the road and check in and see where things are. So I'll be reconnecting with you, I'm sure. But thanks for being here this morning.
Thanks, Peter. And it's nice to be in a group of people who care so much about these issues. So thanks everyone for the work you're doing as well. It's definitely a multi-pronged effort here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone.